The hall was vast, but silent. A single candle burned at each table, its light flickering over white tunics marked with red crosses. The men did not speak. They sat in pairs, sharing a bowl, breaking the same loaf of bread. The sound of chewing was the only thing that moved through the room. It was not an ordinary supper. It was a ceremony. And for the Knights Templar, even the simplest meal was bound by holy law. They were warriors, sworn to defend Jerusalem. But they were also monks, sworn to discipline. They fought with swords, and they ate with rules. In the 12th century, they followed a code so strict that every action, from how they prayed to how they chewed, was written down and blessed. It was called the Latin Rule, a document that told these men how to live. It fed their bodies and punished their souls when they faltered. The year was 1129. Europe still trembled from the First Crusade. Pilgrims flooded eastward toward the Holy Land, and many never returned. In those perilous roads, a small band of knights took a vow to protect travelers and to live as holy men. Their leader was Hugues de Payens, but their spirit was shaped by a French abbot, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard wrote their code, inspired by the rule of Saint Benedict, the ancient monastic guideline that demanded silence, prayer, and self-denial. But this new order was different. These monks carried swords. Bernard called them Milites Christi, the soldiers of Christ. They would fight pagans by day and conquer temptation by night. Their armor was steel, but their truest battle was against the flesh. The Latin rule defined everything: how they dressed, when they slept, how they prayed, and how they ate. Food was not pleasure, it was obedience in another form. The rule stated it should be sufficient for you to eat meat 3 times a week. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, they ate vegetables, beans, and coarse bread. On Fridays, they were allowed fish, or any creature the church considered of the water. That included puffins and even beavers, whose tails were thought to resemble fish. On Sundays, the day of resurrection, they were granted 2 servings of meat, not as indulgence, but as praise. To eat was to honor God, and so the act had to follow divine rhythm. Meals began only after Scripture had been read aloud. No one touched a bowl until the final verse was finished. They washed their hands and the table before eating. They sat in pairs, facing one another, so that one might study the other closely, to ensure that neither strayed into excess or pride. Wine was allowed, but always diluted with water, for Solomon had written that wine corrupts the wise. A brother could not drink more than his companion. If one took more, the other was required to correct him. It was not fellowship, it was surveillance, because purity required witness. And while most monks spoke through signs, the Templars were permitted to whisper softly if necessary, but always with humility and submission. Every rule of the table was written to tame the same enemy: desire. Desire, even for bread, was dangerous. To eat too eagerly or too little meant failing the balance the rule demanded, and that failure came with a price. If a brother disobeyed, if he spoke without need, or reached too far across the table, he was ordered to eat on the floor. There, at the feet of his companions, he would take his meal in silence, visible to all. It was a punishment of humility, not cruelty, a reminder that pride begins at the table. Greater offenses brought harsher terms. A knight who sinned gravely would be barred from the table entirely, forced to eat alone, forbidden from sharing bread with his brothers. A serious fault could mean pride, refusing to share food, taking more wine than allowed, or disobeying a command given at the table. Each knight sat across from a brother who was meant to keep him in check, so to overstep those limits was to break not only the rule, but the trust of the order itself. For such sins, the punishment was isolation, to eat alone, unseen by his brothers. To sit apart was to be spiritually exiled, a wound far deeper than hunger. On Good Friday, the day of Christ's Passion, the rule demanded a fast of bread and water only, eaten without a napkin. No comfort, no cloth, no warmth. A deliberate echo of the suffering of Christ. Even cleanliness was a luxury they could not allow themselves that day. Every gesture was weighed, every crumb carried meaning. For a Templar, there was no such thing as an ordinary meal. To modern eyes, these laws seem unbearable, a life starved of pleasure. But the Templars believed that to control the body was to free the soul. Their table was both altar and battlefield. Gluttony, they said, fed the flesh. Austerity, taken too far, fed the ego. To eat too much was sin. To fast too proudly was also sin. Holiness, they believed, lived only in the narrow path between. Their meals were quiet tests of that balance. A knight might stare at his food for minutes before daring to lift his spoon. He was not proving devotion, he was proving restraint. And when they shared their bread, they were reminded that nothing was theirs. Even a crust belonged to the order, to God and to the poor. After each meal, they carried the leftover bread to the chapel and placed it on a stone table to be given to beggars who waited outside. The loaves that remained whole were saved for the next day. Only scraps went to the hungry, because humility required simplicity even in charity. There was no indulgence, no choice, no comfort, only structure. But within that structure, they found meaning. To them, obedience was nourishment. The rule reached into every corner of life. It forbade pointed shoes and fine fabrics, letters from family, laughter that echoed too loudly. It even dictated how a man could repair his sword. Without permission, he could not. To outsiders, it looked like cruelty. To the Templars, it was salvation by order. Each limit purified the will. Each denial burned away temptation. And so, when they sat to eat, the act was never simple. They saw it as another weapon against sin. Their knives were clean, their hands folded, their eyes lowered. Each mouthful was slow, deliberate, watched. If they endured this, it was not because they were forced, it was because they believed that the devil entered not through thought, but through appetite. To eat rightly was to pray. To eat wrongly was to fall. 2 centuries later, the order fell. Accused of heresy, many Templars were burned at the stake. Their castles were emptied, their banners erased. But their rule, that strange marriage of soldier and monk, outlived them. In monasteries that still stand across Europe, echoes of their code remain. Silence at the table, moderation in all things, charity after every meal. The Latin rule may have been written for knights, but it became a blueprint for humility. Even today, historians read its pages with wonder, not at the battles or the treasure, but at the detail of daily life, because it shows that faith, at its strongest, was lived not in cathedrals or fields of war, but in the quiet discipline of men who refuse to eat freely. The candle burns low. The hall grows dark. Somewhere a bell rings for evening prayer. A loaf of bread remains on the table untouched. Beside it, a cup of watered wine. In the 12th century, this was what obedience looked like. A meal measured not by flavor, but by faith. A hunger answered not by fullness, but by control. The rule fed them, yes, but it also watched them. And in every act of restraint, they believed they were drawing closer to God. Because for the Knights Templars, to eat was to choose between two hungers, the hunger of the body and the hunger of the soul.